Here is your WESN News on the hour. I'm Naomi McNish. Thanks for joining us. Here are the headlines. 2 Tobago teens killed by police in Susulands. Arima man charged with truck driver's murder. Man critically injured in Manzanilla machete attack. And internationally, Japan firm says it stopped making walkie-talkies used in Lebanon blast. Now for the details. 2 Tobago teenagers, 19-year-old Rezin Kwashi and 17-year-old Hakeem Anderson, were fatally shot by police at a guest house in Susulands on September 16th. The teens, suspects in several robberies and shootings, were confronted by officers from the intelligence and CID units. Both were taken to the Scarborough General Hospital, where they were pronounced dead on arrival. A community activist from Golden Lane expressed shock, noting Kwashi's mother is a pastor and he was a talented drummer. Despite being raised in upstanding homes, the area has seen a surge in crime, with reports of gang activity and gun violence increasing over the past few years. Local efforts to curb youth involvement in crime include community events, sports, and youth programs, though more work is needed to address the situation. An Arima man is expected to appear before a master of the High Court charged with the murder of Anthony John, which occurred in July 2024. Sebastian Bailey, aka Fat Boy 26, was also charged with possession of a firearm and possession of ammunition, following advice received from Deputy Director of Public Prosecutions Sabrina Dugdeen Jaglal on Wednesday the 18th of September 2024. John, 57, a truck driver of Arima, was shot and killed on July 15th, 2024. A male suspect who was in custody at the time for possession of firearm and possession of ammunition was cautioned at the Arima police station by officers of the Homicide Bureau of Investigations Region 2 on Friday the 13th of September 2024. Police are investigating the circumstances surrounding a brutal machete attack in Manzanilla. The victim, who sustained severe injuries to his chest and face, was discovered in bushes near the Manzanilla-Mayaro Road on Tuesday night. Residents rushed him to the Sandy Grande Hospital, where he remains in critical condition. Police have been unable to interview the victim due to the severity. Of his injuries. Investigations are ongoing. Internationally, a Japanese handheld radio manufacturer has distanced itself from walkie-talkies bearing its logo that exploded in Lebanon, saying it discontinued production of the devices a decade ago. At least 20 people were killed and 450 injured after hundreds of walkie-talkies, some reportedly used by the armed group Hezbollah, exploded across Lebanon on Wednesday. The devices, according to photos and videos of the aftermath of the attack, appear to be ICV-82 transceivers made by ICOM, an Osaka-based telecommunications manufacturer. But ICOM says it hasn't produced or exported ICV-82s, nor the batteries needed to operate them for 10 years. It is the second Asian company to be embroiled in bombing incidents in Lebanon this week, after thousands of exploding pagers seemingly linked to Taiwanese firm Gold Apollo killed at least 12 people and injured more than 2,000. Gold Apollo founder Su Ching-kwang flatly denied his company had anything to do with the attacks, saying he licensed his trademark to a company in Hungary called BAC Consulting. Well, that's news to the hour on WESN. I'm Naomi McNish. Thanks for watching.
WESN.
There's a quote from Gore Vidal, and he said that the corporate grip on opinion in the United States is one of the wonders of the Western world. No first world country has ever managed to eliminate so entirely from its media all objectivity, much less dissent. Now, I actually would necessarily question his perspectives because the media in America are very split along partisan lines. In most cases, a media entity would be for one side or the other. And usually, I would argue, you would see very similar errors and very similar disappointing takes from both sides. It doesn't necessarily take much. I myself only really look at American news media, of mass media, traditional media, because someone else is watching it on the TV and I walk past, and it could be conservative or liberal. And I find it quite humorous how quickly, it doesn't take long for me to find something to scoff at. Some outlets are trying to get back to a more center position, but it's interesting to watch that exercise take place as they continue to publish work. It's something that we do have here, not necessarily with the media. It's the human inability to be able to objectively speak about something, regardless of what our biases are. To some degree, your bias will always influence your perspective on something. But then I guess what really matters then is what type of bias you have. For me, I don't necessarily have a political bias for a group of politicians or a party, a formal group of politicians. But I do have biases which, with regards to certain subjects, based on history, I have low expectations that upcoming decisions that at least appear similar. So this is where it's a bias, because I'm not necessarily ensuring as much as possible that it's not a different perspective and a different idea. So my bias is that this is the same old, and I will be prejudiced to dislike it, as was pointed out by a caller. But we see this phenomenon with the die-hard supporters of both political parties, and the rest of us are caught in the middle. And I think it's one of those things that we really need to start to understand, because this is human nature. This is not limited to TNT. And it's one of those things where we kind of need to formally acknowledge it and try to understand it and do our best then to push back or safeguard against it. And understanding that to some extent it is to be expected, but then one of the ways that you compensate for it is saying, well, look, this person is biased for X, therefore their opinion on X, the rest of us have to take, the rest of us who do not necessarily have a similar bias to X, we have to take it with a grain of salt. Ideally, when done correctly, the whole situation will kind of correct itself, because all of a sudden, people who are biased for X will realize if they just scream the most outrageous things, they will no longer be taken seriously. The trick, of course, is that usually the outrageous stuff is preaching to the choir. It's not actually to try to get new converts. And this is the issue that I have. We've settled in this space where politicians are quite happy to just speak to the base, but then we get stuck in these patterns of a lack of progress. Because ironically, or maybe not, a lack of trying to progress with your appeal and your messaging and your efforts to be more inclusive. I don't mean about how it's normally used, but rather just politically trying to come together, trying to form unity. Actual unity, not quota unity. It's almost as though, to some extent, by refraining from that, by just sticking with your base, you get a lopsided view of the country because your perspectives are limited with regards to who is doing well and what the problems are and how widespread the problems are and who it's affecting outside of your support. And then, of course, by not being willing to progress in your message, ironically, it contributes significantly to hampering the progression of the country. The reason why I bring this up is I had a very, I guess you could say, controversial example with regards to, depending on the viewer and how they, and what they perceive and what their biases are. Example that I planned last night to show, but because it's based on the American elections and essentially I think the emotional investment on either side is just too high. There's a part of me that doesn't want to have to deal with that anymore. Unfortunately, there are still things that matter in America to our own economy and standard of living. We'll get into that later. But enough about the conceptual stuff. Let's get to the nitty-gritties of what's actually going on in some of the news stories of the country with today's Daily Review. Now, if we had a really thriving comedian industry, I want to say industry, because we have a community, don't necessarily have an industry that would allow for a participation in the national discussion, like what you would see with the comedic industry in the United States. I feel they would have a heyday with this because not too long after the Minister of Finance is talking about a cashless society, one of the biggest current efforts of his portfolio, collection of property tax, has led to a scenario that kind of makes us say, yeah, we should be in a cashless society. If only you would lead the way. Because the police have come out to say now that they are concerned with regards to citizens having to withdraw large sums of cash to pay their property tax and those citizens being targeted. And it seems fairly obvious, depending. If I am an elderly person, I don't have a vehicle, I'm going to pay property tax. I'm not going to go to the bank and then, go to the mall, go to Rituals, go to a hardware store to try to shake off observers with regards to what exactly I'm doing. I'm going to go to the bank. I'm going to try and get a taxi to go to Inland Revenue or wherever I have to pay property tax. And at some point, not every individual who withdraws cash to pay property tax is going to get caught up in a robbery. But it's going to be fairly obvious where they're going to be waiting for taxis, after exiting the bank, and then when they say their destination, what? Most likely, they're going to have money in their purse or money in their wallet. And depending, it's a fairly soft target because it's an elderly person that Assistant Superintendent Edmund Cumberbatch used as an example. That is to say, the robbery done against an elderly individual, a 72-year-old pensioner. Apparently robbed, well, she withdrew $10,000. I believe the money, all of that money was missing. And at the end of the day, we already had issues with people drawing large amounts of cash from the bank being potentially targeted by the criminal element. So again, it made sense, yes, let's go cashless. The problem is, the cynicism of the country is in the fact that while private commercial initiatives have generally gone cashless, it's only if you go to like a small shop that doesn't have a links machine or a new operation that doesn't qualify yet for a links machine, whatever the criteria is, that you will see a business doesn't have a links machine, you have to pay with cash. A lot of small businesses, roadside businesses, have links machines. Now, for whatever reason, apparently, we can't pay links to pay the government, which is kind of crazy. Exactly why is it set up this way? And the minister tried to say, well, you know, online payments complicated, and you know how you deal with the banks. And in my mind, if you really wanted to get it done, a lot of what he said, the real reasons are probably not that, because a lot of what he said, those things should not be such a barrier, unless you're not necessarily willing to spend a reasonable amount of time, and it's not going to take years to solve this. But more importantly, there are other aspects of society that we have to pay for things from the government, and we need cash. And these are little things that could be cleaned up, but again, it seems as though they don't want to spend the effort to do it. So now we're in a situation where what's going to happen if someone is facing penalty for not paying property tax because they were robbed? Because there's going to be a group of people in the country that just don't have the spare cash or income to pay for property tax and meet their bills if they're robbed. What's going to happen there? This is just one more situation where, depending on the circumstances and how things align, they need to kind of align perfectly, and I don't say that as a disparaging way, just in the literal sense of, in order to get this scenario, they probably need to align perfectly. But I could see where this could be another area where someone could legally challenge how property tax was implemented and how it's being managed currently. Because if the government could say, well, we don't want to release information that's pertinent to the accountability of how we spend public funds because we don't want to put lawyers at risk. Don't mind, you know, they essentially taking public money, and to some extent there needs to be somebody to scrutinize this, even if it is not public scrutiny. But myself or to myself cannot be the checks and balances. Government can say that, but, you know, you who have to pay the tax, art thou concerns of safety not valid? Shall thy own safety be taken for granted by the same government that wants to protect the people who they're paying? It's almost like if, you know, the networking and connections is more than just lawyers taking on a job in some cases. Maybe, I don't know. But the common citizen, and here's the difference between the Terence Dale Singh situation and this situation. The people who robbed the Minister of Health apparently were in the same car that they were spotted escaping in. This was done in a taxi. Now you have to try and find an individual. That's a little bit harder. I don't know to what extent they have a good description, but being out in public in a car that you use to escape the scene of a crime is an obvious arrest me flag. An individual who robs someone in a taxi could then disappear into the crowd. Once they get into a dwelling or homicide, if you can't trace them with eyewitnesses and cameras, well, that's it. They're gone to the wind. Unless you get a really good description and maybe you get a break somewhere to kind of be the first clue to zero in on their position, it's done. That's what I fear with this poor woman and her $10,000. But you know what? It's fine. It's fine. If the people can't pay links, we'll just tell them to pay with cash. And those who get robbed, that's just the cost of the government trying to collect money because they're running out of it. Don't mind that it's only supposed to be meant for local government. But we'll see on how the accountability is going to be about that. Because when they don't have the roles for the public to scrutinize what the valuations are, that also hides the money that is coming in. And when you hide the money that's coming in, potentially then you have a greater capacity to, with a lack of accountability, divert some of the funds unofficially for other purposes. Maybe it all gets mixed in with the consolidated fund. All right, let's take a break. We have a lot of stories to kind of clean up for the week. And then, like I said, something happened with regards to monetary policy internationally. We'll get to that later. Maybe how that could affect us. Stay tuned. This is talking about the WSN Content Capital Show. Michael Small. We'll be right back after this.
Transform your home with PCU Plus. From stylish furniture to the latest appliances, we have everything you need to create your perfect space. At PCU Plus, we offer fair prices and affordable financing options that are cheaper than hire purchase agreements. With convenient locations in San Fernando, Tobago, Arima, and our lifestyle showroom in Barataria, you're never far from the best deals. Visit PCU Plus today and discover why we're the top choice for quality furniture and appliances. PCU Plus. Quality you trust, prices you'll love. Visit one of our locations or find us online to start transforming your home today.
Take some time for yourself or spend some time with the family at Sandy Point Village Hotel. Enjoy our various studio and suite apartments, self-contained with their own kitchenettes and Wi-Fi. We also have our famous 100-foot swimming pool and our beachfront restaurant, the Steak and Lobster Grill. And our location in Crown Point puts us near the center of activity from the nylon pool to the local nightlife. Call us and make your reservations at 639-8533, 389-2378 or email us at sandypointvillagehotel@gmail.com. Do not fall for the lies, the cry, and the mama guy by anyone telling you you can't win. And you can't win with he, and you can't win with she. And that's the words from opposition MP Rudolph Molilal, who came out with a message to say that we, meaning the UNC, are strong and united. And do not fall for anyone saying that they can't win the next election on their own, because that seems to be the situation that they themselves are pushing for. We don't want alliances, and we don't want these third parties hangers-on, right, trying to leech off of our greatness. We will do it on our own, which I find on the surface somewhat ironic, and maybe I'm reading too much into it, but I don't know if that's necessarily the best message to put out there. Now, granted, this is a message meant for the political base, for UNC supporters, and I get it to some extent. You want to tell people, let's be confident in ourselves and not try to see who we need, what mercenaries we need to hire for this election now, you know, to try to boost us up to get a victory, because we tried that last time and it didn't necessarily work. The problem is, what did I say at the start? Well, if you just limit yourself to your base, you potentially limit everything. You limit the progression of the country. You limit your reach to the wider country, your engagement to the wider country. Because to some extent, while not directly so, this message is not necessarily one of unity and coming together. One of the things about a coalition is it's not just about getting political parties to come together in order to try to get more votes. Just because there are more of us and we have a wide appeal, because it's not just us, they're the other parties. But there's also the indirect message of we are willing to join with all of these parties, therefore we are willing to join with all of you. Therefore, we represent all of the people who have an issue with the incumbent administration. Because the incumbent administration, by default, they're kind of stuck on their own, right? It's very difficult for an incumbent to say, come and join me as a coalition government. And to some extent, they're incentivized not to try to do that, because then they'll have to share power, but they're already in power on their own. Why would they want to do that? So this message from the UNC, I do think it is strategically a mistake. It's not one that I'm happy to hear. It's not necessarily as bad as the Vote Kamala campaign of the partnership. But I do think it just once again kind of shows not so much a Freudian slip, but just like a lack of understanding on some of the subtleties of what it might take to get the country from where we are now to where we need to be. Because we're on our own. We're on our own island, rhetorically speaking. We don't need nobody else. Well, then why would voters in the middle, undecided voters, moderate voters, although technically we don't, it's not like we have left or right, really. Why would they join the UNC? A lot of people are probably looking and hoping for a third party to just give them something policy-wise that's different to what we've seen before. And it's very hard to kind of hope that either the PNM or the UNC is going to do that, which is why a lot of people in the middle, undecided voters, probably are reluctant to vote for this election. I know I am. Have to see where the chips fall with regards to all of the available candidates. Now, one of the other things about the messaging of, and I want to get his words correct here, we are strong and united. You see, I get it, he wants to say that, he wants to be positive. But when you say something that directly can be contradicted with factual information that is already out in the public, it's not like this is a gotcha moment and you're going to call him out for lying. It's not that serious. It's just, we know that there are 5 parliamentarians in the UNC who went up as a slate for change because they still apparently believed in Kamala. So I'm actually not really wondering. I do wonder if they try to play it down the middle to the point where their message didn't make any sense, but it is what it is. They wanted the party to improve, all the while staying with the, because they couldn't change her, the leader who one could argue is in charge, thus is at least partially responsible for the state the party is in. Now, these 5 are being complained that they have been sidelined. Quite literally, in Parliament, they moved them off to the side. I think Dinesh Rambali was the spokesperson here, where he himself said he had he was not intending to mend his relationship with the UNC's political leader. And he, again, brought up the points about the lack of structure with the UNC and his doubts about the ability, his doubts now, about the ability of the UNC's political leader to win the next general election. And his doubts has at least a little bit of credence because the current administration, the incumbent, and let's not forget, this is a 2-term incumbent. So in modern democratic election processes, those things tend to be unpopular no matter how good it's been going, because it's never good enough to say we want you for a third time. Granted, of course, we've gone through long spells of the PNM winning elections and holding on to power for long periods of time, but I would argue that maybe we should look at our current history, at least in central government. The THA maybe now change gears after a 20-year PNM run, although ironically, before that, I do believe PNM were the opposition party, basically, in Tobago. But now we've gone, you know, we had Pandey, we had Manning, then we had Kamala, we had Rowley. It's not like we had 20 years of one or the other in the last 20 years, obviously. So PNM is supposed to be in a disadvantaged position because they're the two-term incumbent. They have things to directly criticize, and the opposition have very little for the public to scrutinize, because all they have to do is talk. But the PNM actually has to make decisions. So they're disadvantaged, and from a disadvantaged position, they are doing things that make them seem, or should make them be, even less popular with regards to how they're handling or implementing certain things and how they're communicating with certain things. I won't go into the details. I just think at this point, most viewers will understand where I'm coming from. The government is doing things that would make them be perceived to be unpopular. That should make them unpopular. This came up on Wednesday with Karen Shishera when she's saying, look, it seems to be obvious to her that the government doesn't mind doing unpopular things because they do not feel threatened by the United National Congress. And to some extent, that conclusion is hard for me to counter, because I lament the fact, why are they doing things? Why is the government doing things that seemingly is unpopular? How are they handling crime? Is anybody satisfied with how they're handling crime besides the government and their most ardent supporters? I don't think so. I haven't met anyone yet, right? What about the economy? This property tax situation, who is happy with how it's being handled? People are happy that we have it. People are happy that we're trying a thing. But even the people who would defend some of the policy decisions to structure property tax, like Karen, is not defending what's actually implemented and how it's being run. And I would think this is very obvious. We're coming up to an election year. Let's not do things to anger, annoy, and frustrate people, except, I don't know if it's they just can't get out of their own way, but they're doing things to anger, annoy, and frustrate people, but they don't seem to be concerned over the impact it will have on the next general election, because I guess, and that's the thing, I don't think they're that foolish or stupid, so there has to be a reason, and the only thing that makes sense right now is the fact that the opposition party is not a threat to them based on their own estimation, which could be completely wrong, by the way. They could be taken by surprise, and the voting public could say, and vote them out the way how they were voted out in the THA, some ridiculous lopsided margin. It could happen, but that's not the point. The point is, it seems as though the government perceives that the UNC is unelectable. The dissidents perceive that the UNC in its current form is unelectable. Hell, Talking Point has put forward the opinion that right now that situation is probably most likely gone out on a limb to say it in very strong language. The UNC might just be unelectable. Now, in defense of that situation, MP David Lee, the opposition chief whip, he has denied that the dissidents have been sidelined. In fact, I think he tried to basically say, no, they're on the front bench, which is technically true. If you look at the photo, they are on the front bench. They're just, ironically, if we actually go to the literal argument of being sidelined, no, they weren't put to the back of the bus. They were literally moved off to the side. The opposition leader and the chief whip sit closer to the speaker. All of the other UNC parliamentarians sit closer to the speaker. You know, that end away from the speaker, that's where the cameras focus on the least. And that's where the 5 are. So, I get it. The UNC is not going to admit it if it is true, right? Because I don't know, were they forced to sit there? Did they sit there on their own and they're trying to mama guys? I don't know, whatever. But the point is, back to Dr. Rudal Mulial. Is the UNC strong and united? He made the claim. The thing is, one of my disappointments is the lack of unity with regards to crime. And while I'm not saying that this is some evil, mustache-twirling villain of a decision coming from the opposition, the fact is, it seems as though they're not really thinking about things like unity. Now, to be fair, I'm not entirely sure what they're thinking of because I can't really see a comprehensive strategy coming out of their camp either. But I don't see unity coming out of it. Because if unity and bringing the country together to try to fix the problems, as the then PDP, now TPP, was trying to do to win the THA elections, you actually have to do things. You can't just say we are united. You have to actually do things to show you are united, or do things to show that you're willing to come together with other people to figure out a way forward. And if you're going to go it alone, then the people in the middle are basically going to look at it and say, well, I am happy that the UNC supporters have people to seek out their interests, but what about me? Because I'm not voting for the red. I don't have any benefits from the red. I don't want any benefits from the red. I'm just an average Joe who would like to not have my country be in as big of a mess as it seemingly is in now. I would like someone to fix it. I am not voting over who gives me favors, who gives me a bly, who lets me eat a food, and who's going to find me a job where I only have to show up every other Tuesday because that's when the bosses need to account for us in their meetings to say that we're there. And I'll leave it there. Again, it might be similar to yesterday. It's a small thing, but it's a big deal to me because I do believe the Vote Kamala campaign, when the incumbent was technically a coalition government, was a bad idea. And while this is not to that level, I do wonder if the UNC is going to continue to drop the ball with their own election campaign. And hopefully, as we get closer to elections, we'll hear from them, whether indirectly or directly, on that. But, you know, I mean, to some extent, if you can't beat an unpopular incumbent, really and truly, what's the point of hanging on? Let's move on to the next story. This one is pretty straightforward. It's interesting on the timing, I guess you could say. The Minister of Finance has basically said that the budget will be presented on Monday, September the 30th. Opposition has complained that, well, you know, the country's running out of money, so he needs to get this budget done. Toot sweet. It's also in line with the deadline for property tax. So that's kind of interesting. I'm not entirely fully sure if there's any connections or if it's just a coincidence or not. At the end of the day, if the budget's ready, why wait? Hopefully though, because I just said, if it's ready, why wait? Hopefully it's actually ready, and this is not just a rush job. Because to some extent, the whole implementation of property tax seems incomplete, hence rushed. Right? Karen said they knew that it would take time to do things, so they accounted for that, for not getting everything done all at once. But it seems as though, to some extent, the current government probably does know that it wouldn't have been easy to get everything done by September the 30th, but they have publicly kept that deadline up for the public. Whether or not some people believe they will then give an extension, they just don't want to announce it beforehand so that people then go back to waiting to pay property tax. They want as much people to be coerced to pay it. So, is the budget going to be something similar? Is it going to be a rush job? I mean, the flip side is maybe anyway, Of course, let's talk about election goodies. A lot of people are pointing out, stakeholders have already pointed out what election goodies they want. The opposition, of course, is using election goodies in the most derogatory way possible, I would imagine. But certain stakeholders, like the agricultural sector, they're hoping for new things. I do think the energy sector, economists, they're looking for changes in the economy. And, well, ironically, PEP's leader, Philip Edward Alexander, he is actually looking to ask for an accounting of last year's budget. I mean, we should have been asking for that before the new budget upcoming, right? But I think Gary Griffith said it best, and I can't fault him for this, because after the last 2 years and beyond, I'll be surprised if this is not the case. He said it'll be the same old, signifying nothing, because that's what the last two budgets did. They did not signify any sort of strategy beyond cost control. Not growth strategies, not national security strategies. Remember, last budget, there was supposed to be $100 million going to the Defense Force to do something. We have yet to see what that something is, and we have gone to the next budget. Think about that. Things like local government bodies not getting their full allocation tends to go under the national radar. But when the government says we're going to have some initiative that will spend $100 million on the Defense Force to get them more involved, and then they don't really announce anything else after it, because I do remember Keaton bringing it up months after the budget presentation, and we were still like kind of waiting. What was that about? Is it that you just realized you didn't have $100 million? There was no way to siphon it off from some other need? So, Louis Lee Singh brought up early budget, early elections. I don't know if I'll subscribe to that. He's not the only person that said that. I don't know if I'll subscribe to that. But next thing you know, there is one theory that I think is valid with regards to an early election scenario. That the budget and the economic situation is not expected to get better. This has been spoken of by the minister in the court, so it's part of public record. At that time, he said 3 years, then later on, he reduced it to 2. Regardless, one of the things is he's saying things might be rough in the next 2 to 3 years, which means that it's not going to necessarily just fall off a cliff as soon as the budget is read. If it's going to be bad, it's going to decline on a graph line that's going to get worse as time goes on. And that could be a reason why you want to call elections earlier rather than later. Because you don't want the full brunt of the negative economic forces to settle in and then call an election. That's just common sense. If you have the capacity to call the election before we bottom out, then, you know. Not saying that I like it or dislike it, I agree with it or not. I'm just saying it's common sense, right? Obvious play is the obvious. And of course, the opposition has come out to say, well, expect lie and mama guy and blame. The sad part is, to some extent, I understand why the opposition will look at what the Minister of Finance is going to present and say mama guy and lie and blame. But I think because of how they do it, with a lot of generalizations, a little bit of stretching the truth, a lot of generalizations, it causes a lot of the public to eventually lose their money message, because no matter how much truth there is there, we are being browbeaten by something that isn't backed up with enough substance. Because one of the ways that you don't get a lawsuit for slander is you don't be specific about things and you don't take an affirmative stand, although they do tend to take a very heightened emotional stand. But then when you make emotional appeals, at some point the public will get turned off by it. At some point they'll get tired by it, right? And then to some extent, when you make emotional appeals, you stretch the truth a little bit, Listen, at the end of the day, we could criticize the Minister of Finance, but we have to do so in an accurate, objective manner. If we do that, then those criticisms will be taken seriously, not just by your diehard supporters, but by the people in the middle, and even some PNM supporters who are not fully biased. Or if that group doesn't come round to your way of thinking immediately, over time, you will net an effect, because they have people who are vehement liberals who are not going to switch to Republicans in America. But they recognize that, hold on, just because the Republicans are my opponents does not mean I could excuse some of the things that's going on my side. I can't just let it pass, because then I lose objectivity and I lose the people in the middle. I want to get to the last topic, which I think this is interesting, in line with the, and we'll continue talking about the budget. We'll have a pre-budget show at least next week Friday, and maybe throughout the week we'll also talk about certain aspects of what we might want to see in the budget, and then of course we will have post-analysis on WESN. Now, also alongside the budget, Minister of Trade and Industry, Paul Okopi-Skun, said that Cabinet has designated several spaces as special economic zones. They will be announced during the budget presentation on September the 30th. These zones are interesting because they will have certain concessions, certain breaks, etc., etc. But they're meant to try to get new investments. So they're not necessarily zones that pre-existing businesses could just transfer to and enjoy the benefits. At least that is the intention. It's also that to some extent this will also impact, according to EY Caribbean Executive Chairman, the getting TNT off of the European Union blacklist. But I think the key point is, if implemented properly, and I'm not sure about all the nuts and bolts, because you know, with governments, and I don't just mean TNT, but around the world, they might say that this is for a certain purpose, and then they'll implement it, and it might look like it's meant for that purpose, but then the actual reality is it doesn't achieve the purpose, or it's exploited by other people. You know, kind of like property tax being meant for local government, but going into consultative fund. Well, we'll see how that unfolds. So, some of the things is, ironically, no irony intended, but these special economic zones will be exempt from property tax. They will have a 15% corporate tax rate. There will be exemption from import duties on building materials, machinery and equipment, spare parts, other articles as approved by the authority. There will be exempt from stamp duty on instruments for the purchase, lease, and other acquisition of land for the use by the operator. Zero rating of value-added tax on building materials, machinery, equipment, spare parts, and other articles, and so on and so on. But the idea is, again, it's meant for new entities coming up. And this is the thing. I very much want this to succeed. I want this to succeed because, what's my complaints? The private sector seemingly is getting a little bit lazy with their business models. All they want to do is import to retail. The problem is, when I import foreign goods, I pay foreign exchange. When I retail, I get back in TT dollars. This is not sustainable in the long run. And then, of course, we have our food security issue. One of the things that I asked coming out of COVID is, why is it that with a need, there has been no significant private venture or investment, in my opinion, that I have seen, to really crack a dent in a major way? So yes, there might have been private investment, but I'm talking something that will change the game with regards to private food production locally that will therefore impact food security. And I ain't talking about somebody else making more juice and somebody making milk. Kudos to the beverage manufacturers in the country for doing the thing, and in many cases, being part of the exports earning side of our economic equation. Kudos to them for that. But we're talking about agriculture, animal agriculture, etc., and then food processing, production, packaging, the works. Haven't necessarily seen anything done. Yes, we have farmers working, but I'm talking about large-scale commercial investment. And I'm hoping that maybe it's not going to solve all of the problems. We ain't going to build Rome in a day with just the announcement of the initiative, and then woof, food security on September the 31st. October the 1st. Tuesday. It's not going to be overnight, but maybe it might encourage a different business model to dominate the landscape beyond just bring a foreign franchise, import foreign goods, spend foreign exchange to earn TT dollars, and then question why the banks and the government have to limit our foreign exchange. So we'll see how this goes, because this is not a PNM thing, this is a government thing. I need to see how this is being implemented to believe it. When I say government thing, I mean government overall. All right, let's take a break. When we come back, switch the news up north. Not political, economic. Stay tuned to Talking Point. We'll be right back after this.
You are watching Strictly Legal on WESN Content Capital. Just give an overview of what exactly is that split arrangement.
Nah, you don't need to register nothing. You don't need, we can do that another time. But then it becomes a hit, and then everybody starts to want to claim.
The laws that predate many of the independent countries' constitutions are going to be those colonial laws.
We know there are an infinite amount of circumstances that would lead to a murder.
I have a great idea and I have a great concept, but until it's actually expressed, it does not become intellectual property.
Accomplishments or targets of a forensic accountant is to quantify what may have been lost.
We believe we defend criminals and we manipulated the law and we exploiting the system.
A responsible journalist will reach out to the person who they have the information on for a comment.
Federal Reserve has slashed interest rates by 0.5 percentage point. It's the first cut since the pandemic. The move will bring down the cost of borrowing, including mortgages and credit cards in the US. Global markets are reacting to the news, with analysts and investors debating the possibility of more cuts in the near future, while some wonder what the Fed policy change will mean for their own lives.
For tourists outside the New York Stock Exchange and for traders inside, this week's central bank meeting was a big deal. Then came the news from Washington, a drastic cut by 0.5 percentage point. Initial reactions showed some relief.
Unfortunately, kind of built up a little bit of credit card debt, so any kind of rate cut will definitely help me pay it off sooner. I mean, I'm not really planning on buying a house or car anytime soon, but it will definitely help pay off my credit cards.
I think it's going to help the economy through car loans, mortgage rates, home equity loans, you name it, anything tied to an interest rate is going to help the flow of money in the economy, hopefully going to prevent recession and any kind of hard landing, so to speak.
Market insiders agree that the Open Market Committee got it right.
Look, he's got a dual mandate, right? He wants close to full employment as he can get with stable prices. That's what he's balancing. And he finally said, we are now in equilibrium. I've been more worried about inflation until now. Now I'm equally worried about the employment picture as I am about prices. And that's good. We need to hear that.
The Dow Jones might have shown some weakness in the immediate aftermath of the announcement, but the day after the Fed decision, global markets, including Asia and Europe, seem upbeat. In Germany, the Cologne Institute for Economic Research says these are good news. The Fed's strong intervention gives the U.S. economy a better chance for a soft landing. Thus, the U.S. economy can be a stabilizing force for the global economy. German companies and other internationals also hope that lower interest rates help U.S. customers more easily pay for imported goods like cars and machinery, strengthening one of their biggest markets.
Now, the situation with the Fed and cutting interest rates, it's like was said, it's the dichotomy of their jobs growth and their economic growth and controlling inflation. Why does that matter to us? Well, the inflation part is what matters to us, because we saw what happened with their food inflation and what that meant for our food inflation. Now, I also saw another report in the UK where even a G7 country is dealing with food inflation. Not that their inflation levels are high, but the high price of food still is causing people on the margin to have to essentially kind of figure out their bills payments on a day-to-day basis. And we're not talking about people living in a shack. We're talking about people living in a relatively reasonable house, like a townhouse. Not necessarily that big, not necessarily that small either, right? But they're under economic strain and hardship. So we ourselves, I think, need to be very sensitive over anything to do with cost of food. And as long as we are importing our food, we have to look at anything that could impact those prices in the source countries. So now that the Fed has cut the rate, and they expect to cut the rate further, so it's 0.5%, and I believe it might go by another 0.5% to 3/4 to a whole percent, under 4% interest rate. It also may have a trickle-along effect where there's more liquidity available for investment, and dare I say this, loans. It might make it more attractive for us to have more debt, more foreign debt from U.S. markets or loan facilitators, et cetera, financial institutions. And we might do it. We might do more than we would have done if this rate reduction didn't happen, although I think to some extent it was expected. So we'll have to wait and see. It also means that, foreign borrowing to then invest would increase, so how much of that pie will come here? Well, the caveat to that, and I mentioned this on Wednesday as well, look at how they're treating Derek Chin right now. It's not to say that Movie Town is 100% right. Maybe the rent that Movie Town is paying, or says it should be paying, is too low. The problem is, at least right now, it's hard for me to believe that the way how this is being rectified is being done in a fair, civilized, and upright manner. Because to some extent, if the contract says this is what the price is, and you're saying, well, that price is too low, that's nice, but you need to legally find a way to negotiate and increase, and not just try to bully your way through. Because then what's going to happen is, depending on how wrong the Port of Spain company, the port company is, right, there could be a lawsuit down the line. But again, it depends on how wrong. I don't know how wrong or right they are. I just know that the foreign investors, the truth will take a backseat to some extent to the headlines and the sensation and the public perception. And what tends to happen is the exaggerations tend to get more play sometimes on the truth, because the truth is more mundane and boring, right? When it's just a dispute between landlord and tenant and they'll eventually come to an agreement, that part, that's boring. But the whole, look at how we're being mistreated. And then when you have reports of their bailiffs potentially bullying, I say it with quotation marks because I won't necessarily, I don't know if I'll classify that as bullying, but being harsh and coarse with the staff of Movie Town, these things are not a good look. Because this is essentially a foreign investor. A foreign businessman came and opened a business here, which is something potentially we would like to see, although one could argue we don't want to see the profits going abroad, so maybe we don't want to see it. But hey, people talk about FDI all the time, foreign direct investment. Well, they don't want another Venezuela. This is not we haven't reached that point yet, but you can't have the hints or the shades of. You can't. Perception is a hell of a thing. Trust, once lost, once broken, is very difficult to recover. Who is Trinidad and Tobago to the global market? We have, yes, relationships with energy companies. We might have an okay name in the energy sector globally, but what about other sectors? We want agriculture to be taken more seriously. That's what Dr. Marlene Arts wants with regards to this new budget. Well, if we want FDI in agriculture, maybe we don't, but if we do, it won't be Shell or BP doing it, I would imagine. It would have to be somebody else in the agricultural sector. So, and then when they see, oh, look, private businessman, foreigner, may be mistreated, they don't necessarily need to go to the point of is or is not. They might just decide, well, the may is bad enough for me. I don't want to be involved in that. So, this should potentially be good news. But that new money, the new liquidity in the American market, which could then trickle down to other places, might not reach here because... Oh, by the way, we also don't have a tourism product to America. You know, just saying. We have flights to America, but we have no ability to attract American tourists to come on our own airline. We have diaspora. It's not the same thing. All right, let's take a break. When we come back, we'll open the phone lines, maybe try and get through a few more topics, close out the week. Sean Michael Small, this is Talking Point. Yeah, kind of heavy for Friday, but it is what it is. Stay tuned. We'll be right back after this.
Hello there and welcome to AM Prime on WESN Content Capital. Before we even start this repatriation and reintegration process, we've already failed, or are we doomed to fail?
You've got to invest in the institutions that you've established to carry out those sorts of core functions.
We now get into the regional updates to give you an understanding of what's happening across our neighboring islands.
We have available a number of films that are worth showing.
So it was day one when the French Revolution started to develop the concept of universal human rights.
What happened this time is unprecedented. It's one of the largest terrorist attacks in history.
Let's welcome Carl to the program. Carl is over there, next in stuff. Hello, Carl.
Silky anteater or pygmy anteater, and we have 2 of the 3 species of anteaters right here.
Join me, Dr. Nalini Kokram, on What's Up Doc, where we discuss all your burning questions concerning health.
Trinidad and Tobago is among one of the highest risk group of patients that develop this form of genetic breast cancer.
What I'd like to take home from a short interview like this, screening. You must screen.
Because it's silent.
It's silent.
Yeah.
And because it's silent, you don't know it's there.
What's Up Doc, every Tuesday and Thursday on WESN, Content Capital.
All right. As you can see, it's just been me this morning. Just me, and more me. Apologies if you don't like this much of me. You could change that by calling in, and we could have more of you. You could call in and have your say to close out the week. You could talk about topics that we've mentioned this week, topics on the horizon. For next week, of course, we could start the budget conversation here now. Or you could talk about anything that is pertinent to you, that is bothering you, that is important to you, that you've just seen in today's papers. We don't have to go any past or any future. You could call and have your say. Call in where you agree or disagree with me. Of course, in the meantime, there are things that I can talk about. Feel free to interrupt me if you have something to say. But I want to continue on with, well, indirectly with the budget talk. Because there is one story that I found interesting, and I do wonder to what extent it's realistic, the views of the individual and of the parties mentioned in this article. Right? The Energy Chamber has come forward, its president has come forward with a position for the removal of the electrical subsidy in the upcoming September the 30th budget. And this is after TNTech apparently looking into the commission, looking into the rates of electricity. Now they've said, we're not looking to increase the rates, but the president of the Energy Chamber is saying, maybe we should. Saying that they have to remove the subsidy on electricity in the country because they could be using the natural gas for electricity generation to earn a lot more foreign exchange if it's put into petrochemical and LNG sectors. Okay, maybe. An increased rate doesn't mean a higher bill if energy efficiency policies are implemented. Here's where it gets idealistic. That line right there. Because just because you increase the rate doesn't mean that you're going to be able to divert some of that natural gas to other sectors of the economy and not into energy production. Because in order to get that realization, right, we could be earning a lot more foreign exchange if we put it into petrochemical and energy sectors. Well, that means we have to have a reduction. Now, yes, if the price of electricity is higher, we probably would have some amount of reduction. But to some extent, some of the consumption is going to be inelastic. You know, the curve is not this, the curve is more like that. Yes, it'll reduce. Will it reduce enough for it to matter? Meanwhile, of course, you will impact the balance of the economy. You just will. Now he's saying that they need to have subsidies in place for the poorest households, but better off households. Right. Who is in the cutoff, and at what point can we be 100% certain that it's going to be fair and reasonable? And we're not going to have people that fall through the cracks, because usually that's what the case is. But then also the line, and I mentioned it before, an increased rate does not mean a higher bill if energy efficient policies are implemented. Therein lies the idealism that is unrealistic, because you are expecting both a government, and governments around the world are notorious for not always being efficient in its implementation. That's just the way it is. You want them to introduce energy efficient policies. You want the public to abide by energy efficient policies. Meanwhile, at the end of the day, because he wants to see a green economy. Now, I don't know to what extent that is part of the incentive here, to get a green economy, because let's go green. Let's go green, but the economic conditions in Europe said that Germany, one of the leading countries of saying let's go green and trying to tell the rest of the world, don't use fossil fuels like we did in the industrial age, you need to be green. They went back to coal. They didn't just do more natural gas. They went straight back to the boogeyman of coal. The economic reality is green initiatives aren't actually cheaper. They appear cheaper in most cases because they're subsidized. They're also not necessarily cheaper to operate for very practical reasons, for very practical limitations that I've pointed out on the show already. The most obvious one being solar panels do not generate electricity at night, when that is where most people in their households turn on their light switches. Yes, you could have battery storage, but on a power grid level, you lose a lot with regards to transmission, and then you lose from storage, because it's just not going to be 100% efficient. So what's going to happen is, we're going to get some electricity, we have to transmit it to the batteries, lose a little bit, store them in the batteries until we need them, lose a little bit, then transmit it across the power grid, lose a little bit. Will it be enough then to maintain our nightly usage? I don't know. I don't know if it will be enough. Of course, wind, there'll be times when they have no wind. And a power grid really does not like it when the need is not being met, because then you have things like outages, maybe power surges or low voltage. To what extent could it damage electronics, or just inconvenience people who have to go through a night? Let's not forget now, we have had to deal with higher temperatures more than ever before. And for the next few days, there is a hot spell warning. The hot spell warning, we're going to go in Trinidad as high as 34 degrees. It's not just about having ACs. Even having a fan could at some point be beneficial. I know by me, it's not cool at night until after midnight. And to some extent, things like heat does affect the health of the citizens. So we are now, before, when we had a stable temperature range, we didn't necessarily have too much in the extremes. We were comfortable. You know, we didn't have to go through so many things that other countries that have to go through with heat stroke and exposure to the cold elements, because they have more extreme temperatures. And thus, energy prices are even more important over there in the past. But now I'm going to argue that energy prices here in TNT are going to be more important depending on how bad this climate thing goes. It's a catch-22, because they're saying, well, the more fossil fuels we burn, the worse the climate gets. I get it. But the immediate concern of not being sick, potentially not dying, and also not going broke, at the end of the day, to the human psychology, they trump idealistic, let's just go green because somebody says we need to go green. People say the science is there. I argue the science is very much in its infancy, not saying that they don't have a point, not saying that we don't have an issue that needs to be addressed, but the immediate needs of survival will trump the long-term needs of survival. Because what does it matter if I can't survive today about questioning the ability to survive tomorrow? Not saying that this is the mindset that should be the case, but rather this is the actual mindset of a lot of people around the world and a lot of countries and societies that are facing these questions, that are facing the economic need versus going green situation. Or like in Germany, not just the economic need, but also we need to survive winter. That's just how it goes. We would like to not die if winter is a harsh one. And, you know, so excuse us for using coal to go back to our energy generation because we have a natural gas supply disruption because of a war. Who would have thought? So it will be interesting to see what the public would make of that idea to remove another subsidy. To what extent are you going to be concerned, not amused, bothered, aggravated, or frustrated? And to what degree can we ensure that the most vulnerable are affected? But here's the thing. One could say, but businesses could pay. Unfortunately, we have developed an economy that is based on certain things. One of the things it's based on is the availability of foreign exchange. That's why we're having problems now when the foreign exchange is not available. And if you want to see how bad it could get with a foreign exchange, just you go look at Sri Lanka. But it's also based on our wage level. It's based on our utilities rates. It's based on our tax level, etc., etc. So when property tax comes in, some businesses are going to have a hard time adjusting because their margins ain't that big to begin with. And if electricity rates goes up, some businesses will have a hard time adjusting because depending if they're a manufacturer, their electricity rates might be quite high. And then, of course, at times, the price will be passed on to the consumer. And oh wait, what about trying to insulate the most vulnerable in the economy because we'll make sure they still have an energy subsidy? Well, will all of their suppliers have energy subsidies? Because people who are at the lower economic brackets tends to buy cheaper goods designed to be more cost effective rather than being all of the fancy quality with the fancy packaging and the fancy this and the fancy that and the fancy chemicals and what have you. They're designed to be cheaper, more cost effective for a certain economic bracket. Now, I could be wrong, but I would imagine that the margins per unit of such goods will not be as high as a high-end luxury option. It doesn't cost that much more to actually manufacture a Ferrari as opposed to a Toyota. The research and development might cost more, but the actual, the materials, the assembly, it doesn't cost that much more. But yet, the profit margin on a high-end Ferrari is going to be more than a mid or low-level Toyota. And then if we go to the specific budget model car, but now apply that to foodstuffs, apply that to diapers, apply that to medicines, apply that to clothes, shoes, apply that to electronic devices, which is now becoming more and more of a necessity for children's education. Apply that to cars. Home supplies, plumbing parts. Well, maybe not plumbing parts. I don't know if you should be using cheap goods for your plumbing. Furniture. Not everybody has the most expensive of furniture. Not everybody has the most expensive televisions. Not everybody has televisions. The economy is based on a certain balance point. And I don't know if the energy chamber is potentially looking at all of the implications. Yes, the electricity is cheap. Yes, there will never be a good time to remove the subsidies. Case in point, the gas subsidy. But this is something a bit more widespread, price of electricity. And given the current situation, maybe we might need to do so in a couple of years, depending on our supply of natural gas. Maybe we might have to. Or maybe it's just too much of a cost to bear. So it'll be interesting to see how far this goes. I don't even know if this is going to get traction with the politicians. I don't expect it to get traction with the citizens, who generally respond negatively to any price increase. But I do wonder if we need to be careful with regards to, not necessarily, I won't call it short-sighted thinking, but rather just limited thinking. We have something we want to achieve, and we will try to find a model that might achieve it, and we will not necessarily try to fully flesh out the idea to see what all of the implications are and to try to address all of them. And maybe to some extent it's not their job. They're just putting forward the idea, and once it's out in the world, we can discuss it if we are willing to engage or not, and in doing so, refine the idea further or not. But these are interesting times we live in. Going back to the point I was trying to make about the opposition, and not necessarily understanding the position they're in, and maybe they're right and everybody else who says opposite is wrong. But I do wonder if to some extent Mr. Manning had a similar idea. He thought that the UNC is not popular enough to unseat him, so he's safe, so he could make aggressive moves. And what started off as moves for the good of the country eventually kind of started to get too aggressive, and at the very least they were perceived to be heavy-handed, dictatorial, etc., particularly with how government contracts were being handled, what contractors were getting what jobs, etc., and so on and so on. It's not to say that he was perfect in his last term of office. You know, we've pointed out, as it was brought up by a caller, hey, what happened with the community leaders and engaging them? And to what extent did that engagement now contribute to the situation we find ourselves in, where gangs are also part of the eater food situation? Good ideas, good intentions, maybe the execution, questionable, fell short, problematic. At the very least, the country didn't respond well to it. Here's the thing, and I've said this before, the opposition, the UNC, was not popular enough to unseat the PNM based on one interpretation of that election. It took a coalition. Not only will a coalition maybe help you get the votes you need, it also, at least I think at that time, told the rest of the country, look, those of you who did not want the PNM or the UNC, you have a way forward to choose somebody else. And yes, we're still in a coalition with the UNC, who is the majority partner. But the COP support was growing. Now one could argue there's a conspiracy theory that that whole People's Partnership and how everything went down was in part, it had the effect of undermining the COP and thus cutting out any legitimate future challenger to the number 2 spot, to the positions of the top 2. And I lament the COP's decline significantly. I don't even know to what extent, how much they're still operating currently. And maybe the opposition is right, the alliances are not practical, but to some extent, I would argue maybe Mr. Manning had the same sort of political analysis that the current administration did. Some of the people in this administration were there in that administration. Some of the same political movers and shakers and wheelers and dealers. And it's not hard to see how they could come to a similar conclusion. And now, by saying that they're going to go it alone, to what extent is the opposition playing into the hands where the current administration does not have to worry about that possibility anymore? Because while it was thought that the COP maybe took votes away from the UNC, remember, not too long ago, before the PDP imploded, it was thought that the PDP's expansion to Trinidad could have potentially taken votes away from the PNM. And maybe one of the other things that we have to lament, yes, obviously, I'm not going to say that it could have worked with Watson Duke and Farley trying to work together. Watson Duke seems to be too much of a loose cannon. But let's just kind of take the surface of what it was and think about what could have been if we just got those basic premises. If we just got a party using the Tobago election victory, the THA victory, to kind of springboard itself. It's proving to the country we are legitimate. We have won this major election. We are legitimate. Now we want to expand to Trinidad. Then it gives undecided voters confidence that this is not a fly-by-night operation. And this is not a one-man show operation, which a lot of the third parties in Trinidad are perceived to be. And then, here's the thing. It's not that I want to see somebody just take votes away from the PNM because I don't like the PNM and I want to stick it to them. No. Then what would have happened is the PNM would have had to change their approach. And I would argue, I would hope that it would be for the better because there would be more competition in the landscape. Because what happens when the competition is removed from the landscape, I would argue, it had the reverse effect for the opposition party. They got worse, not better. They got weaker, not stronger. And similarly speaking, when the opposition got weaker, not stronger, because of a lack of competition, the government got weaker, not stronger. They won't see it that way. They are not going to see it that way. But there's a reason why, as time went on, the complaints about government policy and implementation and government decisions became more and more compounded, and controversies that started with government decisions or legally could only seem to come from government positions, but we don't know for sure. But legally, if they came from anywhere else, it might have been a crime. So, Brent Thomas. They started to pile up more and more. And I believe it's because the political analysts or the politicians who are analysts, don't know if they could necessarily want to call them political analysts, could be a semantics. They were looking at the UNC and the weaknesses there, and then complacency set in. We don't have to try hard. We don't have to do a lot. They did put some effort into local government elections, but ironically, I would have hoped they might have taken away the lesson we didn't put enough effort in, and this is why our results are lackluster. But they're kind of already on a certain course with regards to the country, and it's hard to tell us we're doing the best and we're going to change things when we're not really seeing change. We're going to improve things when we're not really seeing improvement, because it's taking everything they have just to kind of hold on to what we already got, as we're still losing. We're still declining, slowly but surely. Maybe what we need is a heavier shakeup. I had a more controversial video, I think I mentioned earlier, that I could have shown today, and I rarely refrained from doing it. Maybe that's what we need to do. It wasn't controversial in the sense of rail, bubble, and bacchanal. It was controversial in the ideas and principles that it presented, the preconceived notions that it challenged. But to what extent are we ready for that? Democracy is an advanced form of civilization. It's not the best. One could argue it's not even good, but it's what we got. And it's advanced not because it in and of itself is complicated. It's actually probably more straightforward than we think. We just make it complicated because it's humans that makes it so. Not that we choose to make it so. Our nature, our behavioral patterns, our psychology, it makes something like choosing a government very complicated. But if we want to have a free society, we need to have a system of government that allows for that. We don't want to become like some of those Russian oligarchs and some of those Chinese billionaires who they had to get a reality check with regards to their freedoms, no matter how rich they were. They weren't free to necessarily command the respect that Western billionaires were free to do. But if we want that freedom, we have to earn it and protect it. We have to act in manners that allow us to deserve it. We have to do our part to maintain it, to build it, to keep it growing. We have to continue to move forward and not just set back and hope for the best. This budget is coming up. It'll be very interesting to see not what the talking heads have to say. Of course, there will be a lot of technical truths, but it's what the country is going to respond to this budget, the budget before the election. And I'm probably going to be even more on that topic as we get closer and closer to whenever the election date is going to be when it's called. And hopefully, I myself am not going to be lamenting the results at the end. And I don't have a stake in any particular party winning. I just want to see a result where I could see a way forward, not seeing a continuation of our decline. All right. I think that about wraps it up. Enough about me. Hopefully, folks, you will stay safe out there. Be mindful of this heat wave. Try and stay indoors. I know it's supposed to be healthy to be outdoors, right? Until it's not. Make today and this weekend a good one. As Mr. Shah would always say, remember your allegiance to each other and to the Republic. Be mindful of the crime, even when the government is getting you to have to withdraw cash to pay their taxes. We will see you next week. Bye-bye.
WESN. women and children. France hasn't had a government since July, but that may finally be changing. Prime Minister Michel Barnier has submitted his proposed cabinet to President Emmanuel Macron, and confirmation is expected this weekend. Now, the full list of 38 names hasn't been made public, but both the left wing and the far right are already mad about it. Laurent Berstecker looks at some of the new faces being proposed.
After 2 months of political deadlock, France could be edging towards a new government. Prime Minister Michel Barnier submitted his list for a new cabinet to Emmanuel Macron on Thursday, with some names already filtering through. These include Conservative Senate leader Bruno Retailleau, touted for the Interior Ministry, a nomination that would mark a shift to the right